All right, so today we're going to talk about two labor unions, two of the important labor unions of the Gilded Age. We have the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. So we're going to look at how these two unions approached the organizing of workers in similar ways, different ways, and kind of what their goals and who is in them and all those kinds of things. So when we look at the Knights of Labor and the AFL, both of these are labor unions, right? So they're both labor unions in the late 1800s. They both are looking to lower the hours that people are working to the 8-hour workday, which would become the standard much later on, and that's kind of what it is today. And because they are labor unions, because of events like the Haymarket Square bombing, they were seen by middle class as radical because they are organizing workers together. And in the late 1800s, that kind of creates fear of, the relatively new idea of socialism and Marxism. So these two labor unions were seen as kind of radical, kind of organizing workers against kind of the management. And remember, middle class people were part of that management class. They were middle class people were the ones that were managing the factories and that sort of thing. They weren't the ones that were working in the factories as laborers. The members of the unions were. So they were seen as kind of radical. Also, when it comes to women, the AFL is a little more complicated, but they did encourage women to unionize in women-dominated industries, not so much in industries where women are working in the same industry as men, but in areas where it was only women. So, for example, there was a hosiery factory, like women's like undergarments and that sort of thing. That would be a women-dominated industry, and so the Knights of Labor encourage women to unionize there. And the same thing for the AFL. Now, when it comes to women as members of the actual union itself, they'll take a different approach on that. All right, so I want to talk about their ideas first and their goals, right? The Knights of Labor they obviously wanted better wages and shorter work days, that kind of thing. But they actually had a broader perspective on how to kind of fix the economy for workers. They wanted to reform the entire economy. They wanted these worker cooperatives, basically giving workers part ownership in the companies. And that was a scary thing to a lot of people because that kind of goes against ideas of capitalism. It's seen as more of a socialist idea. They also wanted to eliminate child labor because child labor was a thing at this time. You had children that were working at 8 years old, 10 years old, working for 12, 14, 16 hours a day. And then they were also antitrust and anti-monopoly because they saw trusts and monopolies when you have one industry controlling businesses. That's bad for workers because workers don't have the option to go work someplace else. You either work for the company that is the dominant monopoly or you don't work at all. They don't have to pay you. They can underpay you, and they have all the power. On the other hand, the AFL had their ideas a little more moderate and more conservative. They focused on the actual material kind of benefits of working, higher wages, better working conditions, safer working conditions, that sort of thing. They weren't out to change the entire economy. They just wanted to make sure that workers got a share of it, that they were not being exploited or taken advantage of. Whereas the Knights of Labor wanted to kind of change the structure of the economy and kind of change the rules of the economy. The AFL was working within those rules, but was just looking for more, as Samuel Gompers would say. Now, in terms of tactics, the Knights of Labor preferred to arbitrate or have negotiation to achieve their goals, a little more cooperative. Whereas the AFL was fine with using strikes as kind of a key weapon to achieve their goals. Now, one of the key differences here is who's in the union, which we'll get to in a moment. The AFL can get away with strikes easier because their workers are more difficult to replace because they're skilled, as we'll talk about later. Whereas the Knights of Labor, strikes could be ineffective for them because they would just get fired and replaced with new unskilled workers because there were skilled and unskilled in the Knights of Labor. So one of the ways you can think about these two ideas of their ideas to reform the economy and their use of arbitration and negotiation is they were idealistic. They wanted to kind of fix things and make things have a more perfect world. Whereas the AFL recognizes that, you don't ever get everything that you want. So you have to be pragmatic, you have to be practical, be realistic, and think about what the best way to go about it. So they have different approaches, kind of fundamentally, an idealistic perspective from the Knights of Labor and a more pragmatic perspective from the American Federation of Labor. Okay, now in terms of how the unions were organized, the Knights of Labor were much more loosely organized. They had a leader, Terence Powderly, but he's not as significant. The AFL had a much tighter organization. They were led by Samuel Gompers for a long time. It's definitely a name you should know. And his leadership kind of really cemented the American Federation of Labor as the most prominent labor union of the Gilded Age in the early 20th century. Okay, so who's in the labor union? You have the Knights of Labor. They included all workers, right? They were skilled and unskilled all together in one union. They included women. They had specific women's bureau of the Knights, and they also allowed African Americans to join. Remember, this is during the time of segregation. The AFL, they represented skilled workers, though, so no unskilled workers, because they felt that was harder to represent. And generally speaking, they didn't really represent women in the union. They kind of had feeling that women brought wages down, so to include them in the workforce would suppress wages for all workers. And they didn't really include African Americans as much, partly because of who the skilled labor was. Okay, so we're talking about different kinds of people, different approaches, and we see that in their goals and how they approach negotiation. All right, in terms of how effective were these unions, the Knights of Labor kind of lasted a short time. They expanded really rapidly, but they declined just as rapidly. After the Haymarket Square bombing, which was blamed on radical people and associated with unions, the Knights of Labor kind of lost a lot of its membership because people didn't trust it. They were seen as this radical group. Whereas the AFL was kind of a more slow and steady, right? It grew slowly over a long period of time. And by I think 1901, it had 1 million members, and it became the largest union in America. So the Knights of Labor kind of burned fast and bright, where the AFL kind of had a more slow and steady rise. Okay, so when you look at these two unions, you see very different approaches to how to organize and what you want to achieve, as well as who is going to be in part of the unions. But the similarities, a lot of them are about how they appear to the rest of society.